All right, welcome back to episode 2 of History Through Our Screens. Today I'm joined by Trevor and Gorren. Gorren, you want to take it over and tell us what we're going to be talking about today?
Sure. So today's topic, we're going to be covering kind of when it's acceptable to make a piece of media after a major historical event. So to give an example, obviously movies have been made about Pearl Harbor at this point, but kind of examining when the society that has the event occur to them, when it's okay that they feel like it's acceptable to make pieces of art or media about that event. And I think we'll be looking at both video games and movies as people kind of perceive those pieces of media as distinct and they have different standards for each one.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Um, so, I mean, if anyone has another example, I think we can just plow right into it.
You
Well,
mentioned earlier today about D-Day, how there are still people alive who were there, but that's been almost 80 years now that that's happened.
It
But there are
has,
plenty of video games about it.
right, both movies and video games, and it seems almost acceptable at this point or normal to cover that event from different angles. And I don't think we think twice about it at this point.
Yeah, I would agree.
yeah.
Despite the point that I mean, it's a dwindling number, but there are still people alive today. And a lot of times they've been alive when these movies have come out. That was an experience they had firsthand, and I can't imagine what it must have been like for them to watch it through a piece of media and have that experience that way.
Yeah.
But it seems like society, and I think we can talk about the events themselves, but it feels like since America was victorious in World War II, it's it was much more acceptable to talk about that war quicker after it ended.
Mm. I would agree with that. I
And I,
mean, look at other examples we have. I mean, heck, I don't know if I can think of a single movie based in something like the Korean War, for instance, or a video game.
right, and it's not that we didn't win. I don't know that war has largely been forgotten about.
Technically, that war is still ongoing.
Right? No, that conflict has not been resolved, and I don't know if that's the reason that people are hesitant or there's just a lack of interest about making anything about it.
Mm.
I mean, there was Vietnam, which is a really shitty situation. It's not like we technically won or anything. And there are plenty of games and movies about that one.
There are, and I think maybe the reason it's covered so often is because of the controversy it generated on the home front.
Yeah, that's
Mm.
fair.
And I would argue the mass majority of movies we do have about the Vietnam War definitely kind of put it in a more negative light than we see with World War II, for instance. I mean, World War II were kind of painted out to be like these heroes in this glorious, fight. And I think all the movies we have about Vietnam kind of paint almost the opposite.
Right. I think in World War II we like to see ourselves as the good guys, and I think America has fallen into that. Not that it's incorrect, but I think it's become a moral conflict in hindsight to a large degree, and it's very easy to celebrate it in our culture.
Mm.
Whereas something like Vietnam, you could argue was responsible for kind of the breakdown in trust that the American people have with the government that's lasted even today. And so I think that war occupies a special place because of the controversy that it generated.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and I do agree. I think directors that make Vietnam movies, a lot of them are very anti-war, and they use Vietnam to portray that message.
Yeah.
Looking at something like Full Metal Jacket as an example of that. But I feel like even that movie was not made too long after the conflict ended.
Yeah. Yeah. Comparatively speaking, I suppose so.
1987.
Yeah. That's not that long after. I mean, the war ended in what, 75?
I don't remember off the top of my head, but
I believe the Vietnam War ended in 75.
75.
Yeah.
That was the official. I don't think much was going on that last year, but that was the official end. Was 75.
Well, no, the South quickly fell after we left. But yeah, I mean, we largely left that war kind of an unresolved question, at least in the American context of was it a victory or not, and
Yeah.
people were quickly able to follow up with things like Full Metal Jacket or even Apocalypse Now and have an anti-war view on that as compared to a lot of World War II movies that are made. And even things like, I mean, it's interesting. We also won in the First World War, but it seems like now it's more common. But there have not been as many pieces of media about that conflict either.
I'd say in the past, 3 years, we've probably had more movies, for instance, about World War One come out than we probably have since.
Right.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
And
1917 just came out.
right, and maybe I don't know. Maybe we could think about whether enough time has passed where we can look back on World War One differently than we have been. I don't know if it's just because it was living in World War II's shadow or because that war was such a stain for a lot of countries on their just such a black spot in their history that they don't really want to think about it.
Yeah. I mean, at this point with World War One, I feel like it was a really overshadowed, at least in the American eye, by World War Two.
Right.
I think World War Two is definitely where like uh, our big coming out to the world, I guess per se, as a world power, and I like a forced, almost kind of presence on the world,
Right.
and I think that's why we see a lot more about that. Um, I think World War One also, like you said, was just kind of a dark spot for a lot, probably more European countries, um, than on the American side. But I think, at least in my opinion, I would say just wasn't beneficial to make media about that time. There wasn't a large enough audience that was interested.
For me, I feel like it's hard to see a bad guy in World War One because no one did anything specifically wrong, like the Germans did in the Second World War.
Yeah, the
Like,
Germans at that time weren't Nazis. There was no
yeah.
National Socialist Party.
So I don't. It's harder for me to see a bad guy. So it'd be a lot harder to say make a movie about this side was so much better because there wasn't any really winners.
Mm.
Right, and the World War One movies I can think of off the top of my head don't necessarily paint the Germans in as bad a light as the World War II movies do. And I think the one I'm thinking of is was it the Joyeux Noel, which is the movie about the Christmas truce.
Mm.
I think that
Yes,
was
but I
in the
have
mid
not seen it.
2000s. I mean, it paints all the combatants. I mean, this is before America enters the war, but it focuses on the French, the British, and the Germans coming together and having, they're able to put their differences aside because they all honor the same holiday.
Yeah.
And they all see, they find common ground in that, and they are able to lay down their arms and celebrate that holiday together, which I think in a World War II context, you couldn't make that the same movie. I'm not
Yeah,
like
that's
this
Yeah.
true.
event like that didn't happen, but just because of the perception that people have of the Germans and their status as an enemy at that point.
Yeah. I feel like the lines were a lot blurrier in World War One for sure. There was no clear, defined kind of, this good, this bad.
Right.
Yeah.
Maybe that has helped reflect on the reason that there was kind of a gap in World War One media for what seems like a good chunk of time after it occurred. Is that it's not. I guess it's not the heroic triumph that World War II is
Mm-hmm.
in the same way. And I guess, and to a large degree, maybe it's also because America's involvement was not as extensive.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I can only think of maybe a handful of movies based in World War One. The oldest one that comes to mind probably being All's Quiet on the Western Front.
Right.
Um, Other than that movie, the next movie that comes to mind would be War Horse, which I believe came out in the mid 2000s, like
Yeah.
2010, somewhere around there, 2008. And
Uh,
then again, it felt just kind of dry until we saw the release of Dunkirk.
That's World War II.
Oh, yeah, Dunkirk is World War II. Sorry.
Yeah, I think 1917 would be the most recent.
Yeah,
Yeah, what, like a year or
1917.
two ago?
Right.
I think it was last year.
Mm-hmm.
And just to use that as a starting point, I know earlier we were discussing, I think a really good modern example of our topic would be there's some controversy surrounding, and this might be highlight the difference between movies and video games, but there is a game in development, I believe by a European studio, that dealt with the battle in Fallujah, which is during the Iraq War, very modern setting. And it, even before it released, it received so much pushback that the project got canceled. And now, in 2020, in August, another video game went forward and published a Fallujah themed battle, but it did not receive as much pushback and was successfully released. So it almost seems like maybe enough time has passed now that it's more acceptable. And I can't think off the top of my head if there have been any. There have been Iraq war films, but it seems like video games have kind of been in a separate status because maybe the interactive nature of a video game.
Yeah, that would make sense to me.
Mm.
So maybe now enough time has passed. That war has, for the large part, from the U.S. perspective, it's concluded. We're still active in the area, but it's not. We're not going through the surges we saw in the early 2000s either.
Yeah, I'd say we're much less involved at this point than we were back then.
Right. But obviously, the people that participated in that, or many of them, are still alive because of how recent it was.
Yeah.
And if I remember right, they weren't even the crowd at the time that were protesting the release of any kind of video game covering such a recent event.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm not super familiar with the example you're using, but it piques my interest because there we've had a lot of games based in that period, and it's interesting to see one that had such pushback.
Right. Maybe that really highlights the difference between how society will treat something as interactive as a video game where you get to, it's not that it's more realistic per se, but you do get to step into the boots of someone that would have been there and make choices and take certain actions or not that they would have or wouldn't have. Whereas a movie is more of a set experience. It's telling a story and you don't get to choose an outcome.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's the difference. I don't know if y'all had any kind of idea was why they'd be treated so differently, at least in public perception.
Yeah, I don't really know.
Um, I think it comes down to kind of a societal thing, right? I think for the longest time, up until maybe within the past 4 years, video games were kind of seen as kind of like a non-educational, non-stimulative kind of mindless activity.
Right.
And I think parents, for the most part, saw it as kind of just like mindless violence in the breeding of their children. Where I think movies kind of get a more reputation as like this can be educational. And I would argue that until maybe the past 4 years, video games really haven't had that kind of light shown on them.
Right. And I think obviously now nothing's going to stop the video game industry from continuing to grow. And I'd argue that some of the experiences they're offering now are on par or even surpass the stories that a movie can give you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because they allow you to make choices and allow for different outcomes. Whereas a movie, you've got a set story that's going to happen, no matter what your input on that might be.
Yeah, I mean, take for example the new Modern Warfare Call of Duty game that came out. Was it a year ago now? Last year?
Right.
2 years or yeah.
I mean, the single player campaign. I personally haven't played it, but from what I understand, is quite
Brutal.
brutal and player interacted based.
A lot of people had controversy around you played, I think it was an SAS, and you were breaching a house, and there was a woman in the house who was the mother of a child, but she had a weapon. So you actually had to deal with the threat.
Right.
And that's a lot of controversy was around that because it's so dark.
What is dark, and I guess people draw a line between. I know that scenes like that have been depicted in movies before, but maybe it's the fact that you're actually pulling a virtual trigger
Yeah.
yourself instead of just experiencing it from a third party. Maybe it's more detached to just watch it happen.
There, you actually have to do it in the game.
Right, you
Physically.
actually have to make the input to have the result.
Yeah.
And I think the thing I'm thinking of is there was a scene in a movie called American Sniper that it was also set in the modern day um, Iraq War, and there was a scene where a mother sends out a child with a bomb strapped to his vest, and the sniper has to make a call, and he decides to fire to save his fellow soldiers. But it's still a very impactful moment. But you don't have to, you're not the one having to pull the trigger. You're watching him do it.
Yeah.
Right. You get that kind of shock from seeing it, but it's not the same as actually having to give the input.
Right. Right. And maybe that's I don't. I mean, I think there's some. I think it's almost more impactful to be the one that has to actually take the action because you're having to make a decision.
For
And
sure.
yes, the game will punish you if you don't, I'm sure. It will make you replay the scene over and over again until you make a certain decision.
Yeah.
Mm,
But you still, you have to be the one that does it. And I think that leaves a different impact than just observing it.
right.
And maybe it's that active participation that marks things out differently in different types of media.
Hmm. And see that almost brings the question to mind for me, at least personally, is are we getting farther enough away from these events to feel comfortable with seeing them,
Right.
or are we, as a culture overall, getting more comfortable with some of the darker themes that we're seeing?
Right. That's a very interesting point to bring up because I think kind of even bringing in the Omaha beach example from the beginning at D-Day is we've almost normalized that level of violence through scenes like Saving Private Ryan, the opening stretch of D-Day, being incredibly violent, but the American audience, almost craving that kind of piece of media.
Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe now, the amount of media depicting violent events has increased to the point where people are desensitized, and we're not having to wait as long between a current event and then it being depicted in a piece of media.
I think that's an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are we
Um,
as a culture just getting desensitized to these things, or are we getting far enough away?
well, to give you an example, I think that will help this one is the movie Zero Dark 30, which depicts the operation that resulted in Bin Laden being killed by U.S. forces. That movie, I believe, was made maybe a little over a year after the event actually occurred.
Mm.
So I mean that being very quick
Yeah, that
turnaround.
is very quick.
Yeah. Definitely.
But the movie, was generally well received. I think because Americans see it as a positive moment, even if it is violent.
Yeah, we see him as a bad guy.
Right.
It doesn't seem like there's anything wrong with that.
Right, and it's almost like it's almost a celebration of that violence being acceptable. 'Cause I even remember the night that it happened. Um, for real, because I remember it, seeing on TV them reporting that the operation was successful and people immediately celebrating.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if our culture would have always done that, openly celebrated. I think there would have been respect for the success, but I don't know if people would have openly celebrated the violent act like that.
No, I agree with that. I don't know if it would have happened like 100 years ago.
Right. I don't know if they would have been more solemn in the event happening. So, I mean, maybe you're right. Maybe we are becoming more desensitized um, to those kind of events occurring around us.
And I don't know if there's really a way to tell per se. It's such an evolving situation.
Right.
Yeah, every person's different. It's no way to compare.
Yeah.
No, and I feel like it's very hard for us to look back in time and say that a certain person in the culture would have reacted exactly a certain way. I think it's easy to look back and say that they had different values through kind of what we have, but I'm sure that there were people after World War II ended. I know they were celebrating the war ending, but I'm sure there were people that celebrated the fact that Hitler was killed.
Yeah,
Oh, I'm sure.
And maybe that's the closest thing we're going to have to understanding, for us, the Bin Laden situation, because he was kind of the villain of our time.
Yeah. This is really the only real comparative we kind of have.
Right. And I mean, I'm sure it took a while for the full information to come out, but I feel like America was very solemn about the events that happened in Japan with the bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima.
yeah. I doubt people celebrated that. Like, I have no way of knowing, but I doubt they did.
I don't get the feeling they did. I don't know for sure, but I don't know if it would have been celebrated.
Yeah.
I think people were glad the war was over.
Yeah, they were probably, they were celebrating the war was over, but not that that's what happened, and that's how it had to happen.
Right.
And I don't even think we see a lot of necessarily American media about the bombings themselves, even to this day.
No, I don't. I know we all accept that it was part of the war, and the alternatives to that scenario were going to be maybe even more catastrophic, but I don't think it's something that we openly celebrate. I think it's more of a solemn understanding of what occurred.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, when I think of media, at least movie wise, television wise, that shows the bombings, it's almost exclusively Japanese media that paints it as a very, solemn, sad thing.
Right. Video footage of them picking through the rubble, trying to figure out what to do and what happened.
Yeah. I mean, not even that, just, I mean, even animated shows, for instance, showing showing the life of these people that lived through that before and after.
And would that be coming from a Japanese media source?
For sure. Yeah.
Okay. So they have,
Yeah.
I guess they're going to deal with it their own way in their culture different than we are, I would assume.
Absolutely. I feel like it's viewed as a really kind of sad and solemn thing. Uh, but at the same time, I feel like it's almost looked at, I don't want to say in a positive manner, but almost in the manner of now we can restart in a way, kind of,
Right.
yeah,
like let's learn from what's happened and, you know, be a better version of what we had.
Well, I feel like that's actually a very positive way to look at a bad situation.
yeah.
And I know, at least for our culture, I don't know if we've digested the lessons that we're going to learn from the wars that we've been involved in for the last 2 decades.
Yeah.
I'm not sure when our media is going to evolve to the point where we as a culture accept certain lessons from those conflicts. I mean, I do know for my almost my entire lifetime that those have been going on.
Yeah. I mean, we've been in the Middle East at least, since before I was born. I was born in 98. I mean, we probably entered Middle East, what, 90, early 90s, right?
Well, if you want to count, I mean, if you want to count involvement in that area, I guess with Desert Storm, maybe. I think
Yeah.
Somalia might be too far off the map to say it was part of the same conflict. But definitely for Desert Storm, the first war that America had going into
Right.
Iraq.
The Gulf Wars.
Right. And we as a culture at some point are going to have to deal with that.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
Yeah.
You know,
And I feel like our media portrays it in a way where it makes it hard for us to learn anything from the lessons of these wars. Because media, I don't want to say it's propagandizes our involvement. Maybe it's just more of an over glorification of our involvement.
I don't think it'd be unfair to say that American culture propagandizes its own involvement in conflict. I think every culture does that, and I don't think there's anything wrong with saying that that exists.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we do. Through the movies that have happened so recently after the events, there is a lot of glorification of American valor. Not that that's wrong, but that's what we're focused on right now because the conflict, that the embers are still hot. It hasn't died out for us yet. It's
Yeah.
still fresh, and we want to memorialize, I guess, the heroes that we're going to have in this conflict. We're not reflecting yet. I think we're still participating.
Mm. I think that's a valid point as well. I would agree with that.
But I mean, at some point, it's going to change. Yeah, I don't know if we're going to look at Iraq and Afghanistan like Vietnam. I don't think we're going to look at it like World War II.
That's just the thing. I don't really know how I look at it.
Yeah,
Like it's been going on way before I was born, but it's kind of just a war that's been going on that I'm not really sure why we're fighting. Because it
And
used
it
to be a war on terrorism, but you hear things like that's just died out.
and at this point is it even fair to call it a fully engaged war?
I think it's more of an occupation now.
Yeah,
Yeah. I mean, I would argue that our involvement over there has definitely become more, like you said, of an occupational type of enforced peace almost.
Right.
Um, and me personally, I don't know if I'm sure how to feel on that.
Right. I'm
And
sure you've noticed as well that, while you're trying to form how you feel about it, more and more pieces of media are coming out closer to these events, trying to not steer, but people are trying to get their perspectives of how they feel about it.
yeah,
And I think we as a culture are digesting each of those things, and we're going to decide how we feel about them.
and that's why media is so important too. On a completely different note, but
Mhm.
media nowadays really does have the power to influence people.
It does, and I think there's a positive bent to it where I think media can help people through the experience and help them understand it.
For sure.
Because I mean, the conflict is very complicated, and it's been going on for long enough that I think it's hard to say if it's about any one thing in particular. I mean, there is an overarching goal, but it's just
Right.
it's been going on so long that it's now a permanent part of our, I mean, at least my and your generation's culture.
yeah,
Absolutely.
And I know from talking to people, at least my grandparents' age, that were born and grew up during the Second World War, that they also, that war was a permanent part of their culture, and they're going to look at it a certain way. I mean, it's much easier
It's
for me to divorce my feelings about World War II and look at it logically, whereas I think for them it'd be harder to do that. And I think for us the same with like the Iraq War.
yeah, and again, talking about how long our war in the Middle East is gone. I mean, at least me personally, and I know of people that their fathers have fought, and now they're in their 20s fighting
Right.
in the same spots that their father had or mothers.
Right.
And
It's
I think that
almost
also kind of sheds a new perspective almost on it.
right. And I'm sure we could research this, but I think this is probably one of the longest conflicts America's been involved in a continuous way.
Yeah.
In an active way, yeah.
Right. I mean, I know Vietnam stretched on for a good amount of time, but I think we're past that at this point for us,
Right.
with the modern conflict.
Yeah.
Looking at some of the years, I think we are past it by a couple
Right.
years.
And maybe that reflects in why pieces of media are coming out about it. It's just because of how long it's been going on that we're not gonna we're not gonna let it play out and then talk about it when it's over. It's been going on so long that we're gonna talk about it now.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And you can't escape that as a reality that it's occurring. And maybe that's our way of addressing it is through pieces of media that people make. I think the longer the war stretches on, the more people learn to live with it as part of the culture, and they're gonna express it in media because it's happening and they've gotten used to it.
For sure.
And I think we're definitely, there are pieces that glorify our involvement, but it's been going on long enough. I think we're past the pure propaganda stage as well.
Yeah, I would agree. I would definitely say we've seen some darker slash less glorified media about
Right.
that era at this point.
Right. I know that at least the American Sniper, to give an example, celebrates a lot of American valor, but it also shows the darker side of what soldiers have to go through as individuals, and even the mental strain it takes on them.
Yeah.
Um, I know in that story, it shows that Chris Kyle, who the movie follows, I mean, he even struggles with, he deploys many times and it puts a strain on him and his family. And he has a hard time mentally with losing friends and then just being involved in combat that frequently, which I think is good. I feel that's not something that's addressed as much in a typical World War II film.
I would agree with that. I don't think we tend to see that kind of mental and emotional strain portrayed.
Right. I mean, maybe more modern pieces like Band of Brothers we would, the longer, more personal films, but some of the more classics like even Longest Day that had John Wayne in it. I mean, it was all, America and England are the good guys, or even something like Bridge Too Far.
Yeah.
This is a good versus evil conflict, and everyone's going to fight it out because they're doing the right thing.
It's it's an interesting scenario.
It is. But, as these conflicts continue, we're going to have to, I think we're going to evolve in the ways we're going to deal with them.
Yeah.
And
And
not,
at the same time, it's ever changing because of like you just mentioned, but also as well the way our culture handles things. You know,
right.
it's
And
just
we're not going to handle things the same way our grandparents did.
right.
We're all going to take a different perspective on our time.
For sure.
And, it might take the next couple of generations after us to really dive into a lot of the details on it just because they're going to be more detached.
So you think there's direct correlation between attachment and acceptability?
I would argue there is for sure. And I think that goes to the point of, I think people that have experienced it from our perspective are more, maybe we're more comfortable with having pieces of media that are very fresh and on topic about the conflict. Maybe that's our decision to deal with it. And maybe that stems from our attachment.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I mean, if you look at other major events where there's a strong sense of attachment, um, I mean, if you look at something like the Holocaust, I think the Jewish population has a very strong attachment to that event that has colored a lot of the ways that they deal with it in a very solemn way. But I think it's largely due to such a strong personal attachment to the event.
Us as
Yeah.
Americans, we hold on to 9/11.
True, we
It's been
definitely
20
do.
years, but I definitely still remember it every year.
That's burned into my mind, even though I was very young.
Yeah.
I was 4 months old.
I can remember what my mom was doing when it was talked about on the news, when it was shown. I
Were
mean,
you at home?
I was.
Yeah.
And considering I was so young at the time, it's astonishing, just like you're a few years older than myself.
Yeah, I was
But even
7
both
at
of
the time.
us can vividly remember, the day it happened.
Oh yeah, I remember I was when I was 6 or 7 years old in first grade, and somebody came in and whispered something to the teacher, and I mean, her face, you could see something was wrong, and she immediately turned on the TV in the classroom, and it was there. And that image just burned into my head for forever, even though I didn't know it was happening at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. I remember I was sitting in my living room. My mom she was sweeping the carpet. She was sweeping the carpet, and I believe it was actually my grandfather that called her and told her, turn on the news.
Right. And I'm sure you saw it.
Well, I'm sure I don't directly remember seeing it. I just remember that specific moment.
Right. And so I guess to tie it back to us then, how comfortable would you feel about a film about 9/11 now that was depicted in a very vivid way?
Hmm.
Just to kind of give, since this is something that we experienced, kind of how do we feel about the time gap? It's been
20
19
years.
years.
September, it would have been 20 years by now.
Yeah.
Um. I don't. I don't know how I feel. I wouldn't have any negative feelings about media depicting it. I don't think.
Right.
Um. I just think the media would have to be very careful on how it depicted it.
Right.
And I think that's kind of where the danger of creating media about things like that comes in.
But
You
we have
know,
much more of an attachment.
yeah. I would
Because
say,
I can sit down and watch something like Pearl Harbor and I don't have the same attachment.
right. You don't get that kind of almost emotional response to it.
Yeah, I don't, when I watch Pearl Harbor, my mind does not automatically flash back to that time because obviously I
Right.
wasn't there. But with 9/11, it does. Whenever someone mentions it, I know that whole scene replays.
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm sure we'd all have a much different response to a film that vividly depicted the events of that day.
Yeah. I don't know if, see, it's hard to say, but like,
Mhm.
I don't feel like I would have a negative point of view on it.
Yeah.
But without it happening, I don't know. It's very difficult to try to imagine how I would react.
Yeah, I
Right.
can't think of a movie about the event. Is there any
There
at
have
Um,
all?
been a few made. I know there was one made about Flight 93 that went down in, I believe it was it Pennsylvania? Because the passengers rose up
yes.
against the hijackers
Yeah.
and took back control but were unable to recover the aircraft.
I can only think of one personally that was based on the actual Twin Towers attack.
Mhm.
And that would be, I forget the name of the movie, but it was featuring Nicolas Cage. I don't want to say it was Patriots
I think it
Day.
was
I think
called
that was
World
the
Trade Center.
Boston World Trade Center.
Yeah, I think that's what it was called.
But I remember it has Nicolas Cage, and he's a firefighter, I believe.
Right.
Yeah.
But I mean, other and that, I don't know. I would argue that almost doesn't depict the attack in the same manner. I mean, I would that doesn't really depict the attack at all per se, maybe, but how we handled the attack,
Right.
at least in terms of the Nicolas Cage film.
Right. Now I think even okay, so let's put it if you knew it was coming out in theaters, would you go rush to see it? So I don't know if
I
I would.
think it's hard for me because there's not a lot of movies I go to the theater for nowadays.
Right.
But I think that would be one I would go to the theater for personally.
Okay.
I think it's something I'd like to see as well, just to know more about the event.
Now,
I mean, it's not like I don't, but
following that up, Gorn, would you want to see it in general or just not in the theater?
I might in general, but I don't, if I heard about it coming out, I don't feel like I'd have to go rush to be the first person in line
yeah,
either.
And is that because you don't want to glorify it or because
Yeah, I think for me, I'm
some
still a
other
little,
reason?
I'm a little sensitive about the glorification of the event because I think it, that event was such a big turning point for the country at that. There was a lot of very strong feelings at the time about what we were going to do moving forward. I know a lot of people look back and like to say that it unified the country, which even though I was young, I did feel like people put their differences aside and we were all Americans in the same struggle for a while.
Yeah.
And I feel like, I mean, I'm sure that it will be, I think it needs to be depicted. I just think it has to be, to your point, it's got to be done in a very, at this point, I think, and it's still in a very respectful way.
Yeah.
And I think I would be a little sensitive to people overdoing parts of it.
Yeah. I mean, there's still very much a very large amount of people still alive that have an emotional connection to that, not just because they saw it or they were in the city at the time, but because, of family members or friends that passed.
yeah,
Right. And I've had friends that I know that had people that were there and did not survive. And I know for them, it's got to be even a bigger attachment.
Right. You can imagine for them, it would probably be difficult to see.
Right. I mean, and
Yeah.
I'm sure that's not, it can't be that different from someone that had, you know, a son or a brother that was in the U.S. Navy at the time of Pearl Harbor that lost a sailor.
Right. And to me, that raises the question, right, of what this whole episode's been based on. Why do we get comfortable with some things and not others? And I think it leads back to what you were talking about earlier with having a direct emotional response.
Yeah.
I don't even, I guess you could say if you have an emotional response, you have a connection to it. But
Right.
at the same time, I almost feel like you don't need a direct connection to it to have that kind of emotional response.
I would agree. I know people have very strong things about events that they didn't personally experience.
yeah,
Yeah.
And I think, to bring it back to the topic as well, I think time is kind of what determines when it's okay, it seems.
Yeah.
And I agree. I think we as a society are very inconsistent about certain events being okay and certain not. But I think I think for each event we make a call. And not that society makes uniform decisions, but you can tell that some people are more okay with some things sometimes than other times.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, we're very comfortable talking about the Middle East. I think we've established that at this
Right.
point. But it feels like we're still, I don't want to say iffy to talk about the Vietnam era, but it's definitely depicted in a different light.
Yeah, there's almost nothing about that conflict that's celebrated.
Yeah. I don't know if I can think of a single movie that glorifies that war the same way we glorify things like World War II or even the Middle East.
I don't know if there's going to be another war that we glorify as much as World War II.
Yeah, and like I said towards the beginning of the episode, I think that
Mhm.
really kind of plays into World War II almost being like America's grand entrance to the world as a power.
Right.
Um, because yes, I think by that point we had established ourselves as a world power, but I think World War II really cemented that for a lot of Americans.
I would
Like that,
agree.
I think
Yeah.
for a lot of Americans, they see that as that's when America came out to the world, you know?
It
Seeing
did, and
how we all came together. Yeah.
it was after a conflict where that might be the most. I know, hindsight being 2020, but at least in the American culture, that is the most clear-cut conflict we've ever had.
Yeah. I mean, that was a
These are the
very
bad
clear
guys.
cut.
We're the good guys. And we've never had a conflict since then where it's been that clear. The Middle East, like, yes, clearly we view the war on terror as them being the bad guys, and I would agree. I think their acts are immoral, but we're not fighting a conventional standing army.
Yeah.
Yeah.
World War II still had battles that you can name that almost felt like they were pitched, at least the way we think about them now.
For sure. I would agree with that.
And yes, I don't know if we're going to have another conflict that's that clear cut again, but maybe that's just the benefit of time. Maybe someone from the greatest generation wouldn't conceive of the war that way.
Yeah.
But I
Well,
mean, go ahead.
at the same time, I almost feel like the people involved feel that way.
Oh, I'm sure they're very proud of their involvement,
Yeah.
but I don't know if they'd want to sit down and play through postscriptum's depiction of D-Day.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
but on the other hand, obviously I'm a lot younger than they are and didn't experience what they did at that time, but I don't know if I can count how many depictions of D-Day I've seen in my lifetime through all kinds of media.
Oh yeah. Absolutely.
And it's
Movies,
yeah.
television, books, game, I mean you name it. Music even
Mhm.
talks about the events of D-Day.
And so I don't know how sensitized I am to that at this point. But to think about how, I mean, yes, we won, but about how horrible it would be to be, you're in this boat and the door drops and the enemy has superior firepower and fortifications and you got to win.
Yeah. I mean these guys were for all intents and purposes charging into the face of death.
Right. But I think with that event in particular, because of how important it was to America's war effort, it's so celebrated. I think we're almost kind of desensitized to it at this point.
Yeah.
Yeah. And even I think if we were to have media depicting World War II in a negative fashion from our
Mhm.
side, I think it would be received very poorly.
I agree.
I think, the mass public opinion would be very negative to something depicting us in a negative light during that conflict.
Right. And I know it's taken a very long time, even now, for the Germans to start making pieces of media about their involvement in the war.
Yeah.
Um, The most recent example I can think of is that movie called Our Honor Was Loyalty, depicting a group of Wehrmacht soldiers.
Hmm.
But I think it's taken them a very long time to come around and deal with it.
For sure. I think it's kind of plays into that societal. It was a very dark spot for them.
Right.
Um, and then almost on the complete other flip side of the coin, there's us, and I feel like the other culture that kind of glorifies their involvement. Strangely enough, I feel like seems like Poland is a very proud sense of involvement in the war.
Right. Well, I'd argue that they're entitled to that.
Yeah,
Even after their country fell, they didn't give up.
that's a valid point.
I mean, not even. I mean, yes, members of the British military. A lot of them were able to make it and join up that way. But even the people that remained in Poland, I don't think the spirit never gave up. The idea that they were Polish.
Yeah,
And I'm sure for them that's got to be a huge moment for their culture.
for sure. I can see that.
But yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it seems like every generation is going to deal with the media depictions of their time differently.
Yeah, and that just plays into so many factors of why that is.
Right.
I think it's hard to really quantify all of those reasons. Um, we are kind of closing in here on an hour. We're at 51 minutes here.
Yeah.
So I think at this point it's probably safe to point out any closing thoughts on what we thought about what we discussed today. Anybody, Trevor, you have anything you'd like to add? Any closing thoughts, ideas?
Not at the moment, but maybe after I hear a little bit more from you guys, maybe I can think of something else.
Yeah. I think for me, I don't know if this is going to be your conclusion as well, Gorren, but I think
Mhm.
after talking about it, it's definitely kind of become mine. Is I feel like emotional connection plays into when we can talk about things and feel comfortable talking about these things. I don't know. For me personally, I don't know if it's so much a time thing, but I definitely do feel like it's an emotional connection. How emotionally connected as a people are we
Yeah,
to
to
that
add on to
scenario?
that, I completely agree because I didn't think of like Iran and Iraq and stuff as emotional connection, but once 9/11 was brought up, I thought of actually how much that even means to me. I wasn't there or anything, but I do remember it.
Yeah,
Right. And I do agree. I think we may have stumbled upon maybe a piece of this puzzle that society has emotional connections to certain events, and that's going to determine how we depict them in our media. And I don't. For anyone listening, I wouldn't stop there. I definitely keep thinking and reading about it. And as always, always consume as much research as you feel comfortable with, and always stay curious about these topics.
for sure. And I think that's almost the leading point of this podcast in general is open exploration of things and keeping curiosity alive.
All right, then I guess we'll close it out, and then
All right.
I guess we'll see y'all next week and present a different topic and keep on going. All right, see y'all then.
Have a good one.
Bye.